The rain had not stopped for 3 days over the ravine known as Blackrock Cut, and Daniel Hale was soaked to the bone long before he found the pod. He had not gone looking for trouble. He had gone looking for scrap metal, the kind that sold for a few coins at the trading post and kept his stomach from growling for another week. Ostrava was not a kind world to outsiders, and Daniel had learned that lesson the hard way since the day his transport ship broke down near its border and never left again. He climbed over broken stones slick with mud, his boots sinking with every step, and that was when he saw the shape half buried in the collapsed hillside. It was small, no bigger than a large dog, half covered by fallen rock and thick vines that had grown around it, as if trying to hide it from the world. At first he thought it was a fallen statue, one of those strange carvings the Ostravi people made of their sacred creatures, but statues did not breathe. He froze when he saw the chest rise and fall, slow and shallow. Scales, deep blue fading into a pale silver, shimmered even under the grey sky, catching light in a way that seemed almost unnatural, like a screen flickering instead of skin catching sun. Daniel had heard stories about the royal dragons since the day he arrived on this planet. Every child on Ostrava was taught that dragons belonged to the crown, sacred beings tied to the bloodline of kings, untouchable by common folk and utterly forbidden to outsiders like him. He had never seen one. Nobody outside the palace ever did. And yet here one lay, alone, wounded, and dying in the mud. Daniel crouched beside it, every instinct screaming at him to walk away. Touching a royal dragon was a crime punishable by death on this world, and being a human already put him one step away from trouble in the eyes of the local guard. But the creature's eye opened, just barely, a thin golden slit staring up at him with something that looked less like animal fear and more like exhausted hope. It let out a weak sound, barely a whimper, and Daniel felt something in his chest tighten that had nothing to do with the cold rain running down his neck. He looked around, no patrol drones, no guards, just broken stone, fallen trees, and silence. "You're not supposed to be out here," he muttered, more to himself than to the creature. "Neither am I really." The hatchling did not answer, of course, but it shifted slightly toward him, as if trying to close the distance between them despite its injuries. There was a deep gash along its left wing, already crusted with dried blood, and one of its back legs bent at an angle that made Daniel wince just looking at it. Whatever had happened here, this small creature had been through something violent, something that had left the wreck of a small transport pod scattered nearby, its metal casing scorched and half sunk into the mud a few feet away. Daniel had spent enough of his life fixing broken machines to recognize battle damage when he saw it. This was not an accident. Something or someone had shot this pod down. He should have reported it. That was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that would keep him out of the crosshairs of a kingdom that barely tolerated his presence as it was. But smart had never been the thing that kept Daniel alive out here. Stubbornness had. And something about the way the hatchling looked at him, trusting him despite every reason not to, made the decision for him before his mind had even finished arguing with itself. He shrugged off his worn jacket, wrapped it gently around the shivering creature, and lifted it into his arms. It was heavier than it looked, dense in a way that did not quite match its size, but he adjusted his grip and started walking, keeping to the tree line, avoiding the open paths where patrols sometimes wandered. The hatchling made a small sound against his chest, almost like a sigh, and settled into the warmth of the jacket. Daniel glanced down at it as he walked, mud squelching under his boots, rain still falling steady and cold. "Don't get used to this," he said quietly. "I'm not exactly built for taking care of things." But even as he said it, he knew it was already too late for that kind of talk. He had made his choice the moment he picked the creature up, and there was no version of the next few days where he simply walked away and pretended he had seen nothing. By the time he reached the old maintenance shed he called home, hidden behind a ridge far from the main settlement, the rain had turned into a light drizzle, and the sky had begun to darken with the coming night. He laid the hatchling down on a folded blanket near the small heater he used to keep warm during Ostrava's brutal winters, and for the first time he got a proper look at the creature in the dim light. Its scales shifted color depending on the angle, blue to silver to something that looked almost like circuitry patterns beneath the surface, faint lines of light pulsing gently along its side in rhythm with its breathing. That was not natural. Daniel had seen enough machinery in his life to recognize when something organic was hiding a very different kind of secret underneath. Far in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the low hum of patrol drones echoed across the valley, sweeping the ravine where he had found the hatchling only hours before. Someone, somewhere in that kingdom, already knew something precious was missing. And now, without meaning to, Daniel Hale had become the one person standing between that secret and the people desperate to find it. 3 days passed before Daniel dared to leave the shed for more than a few minutes at a time. The hatchling's wing had begun to heal, thanks to a mix of stubborn care and a medical kit meant for humans that he had adjusted as best he could guess. Its leg was still bent wrong, wrapped tightly in cloth and splintered with a bent piece of scrap metal, but the creature no longer whimpered every time it moved. It had also started following him, hopping and dragging itself across the small room whenever he so much as shifted his weight, refusing to let him out of its sight for more than a few seconds. He had not named it. Naming things made them harder to let go of, and Daniel already knew, deep down, that he was not supposed to keep this creature at all. That morning, he decided it was time to find out exactly what kind of trouble he had wrapped in his jacket. He left the hatchling curled near the heater, wedged the door shut with a plank, and made his way toward the trading post at the edge of the settlement, where a woman named Myra ran a stall selling old parts, spices, and whatever gossip happened to wander through. Myra was one of the few locals who did not flinch at the sight of a human walking up to her stall. She had lived long enough to stop caring about the old prejudices, or so she claimed, though Daniel suspected it had more to do with the fact that his coin spent the same as anyone else's. "You look worse than usual," she said, without looking up from the crate she was sorting. "That's saying something." "Needed information," Daniel said, keeping his voice low, "about the royal dragons, specifically what happens when one goes missing." Myra's hands stopped moving. She looked up slowly, her eyes narrowing, scanning the empty street behind him before she leaned in closer. "That is not a question you ask out loud," she said. "Not here. I'm not asking for fun." She studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing something in her mind, before she set down the crate and gestured for him to follow her behind the stall, out of view from the main path. "Dragons do not simply wander off," she said quietly. "They are guarded from the moment they hatch. If one goes missing, it is not an accident. It means someone inside the palace wanted it gone, or someone outside wanted it badly enough to risk their life stealing it." Daniel's stomach tightened. And if a pod carrying one gets shot down outside the city, in restricted territory, no one is supposed to enter. Myra's expression shifted, something between fear and disbelief crossing her face. Then whoever did the shooting either wanted it dead or wanted it to disappear where no one would think to look. She paused, studying him carefully. "Why are you asking me this, outsider?" He did not answer directly, just trying to understand what I might be dealing with. She grabbed his arm before he could turn away, her grip surprisingly strong. "If you have found something you should not have, get rid of it, whatever it is. The crown does not forgive mistakes, and they especially do not forgive humans." Daniel thanked her for the warning, though he had no intention of following it, and made his way back toward the shed with his mind racing. Along the way, he passed a supply depot filled with old machine parts. The kind of place he sometimes scavenged from when the guards were not watching closely. On a whim, he grabbed a small handheld scanner from his bag, one he used to check wiring and old circuits, and slipped it into his pocket. When he returned to the shed, the hatchling greeted him with an excited hop, nearly toppling over on its bandaged leg before catching itself against his boot. Daniel knelt down and, almost as an experiment, held the scanner near its side. The device let out a soft beep, then a longer whirring sound, its display flashing lines of data that made no sense to him at first. But one thing was clear immediately. This was not a normal biological reading. There were patterns beneath the scales that resembled circuitry, faint signals pulsing in rhythm with the hatchling's heartbeat, as if some part of it was mechanical, woven so seamlessly into its living body that no one without proper equipment would ever notice. The hatchling tilted its head, watching him with something that almost looked like curiosity, then let out a soft hum that made the scanner's display spike sharply. Daniel sat back on his heels, stunned. Sacred creature of the royal bloodline. That was what every story on this world called them. But sacred creatures did not have circuitry hidden beneath their skin, humming in response to old human scanning tools like they recognized the technology. Before he could process the thought further, a distant sound cut through the quiet of the evening, the low mechanical whir of patrol drones sweeping closer than they had in days. Through the small gap in the shed's boarded window, Daniel caught sight of flickering lights moving along the ridge, methodically scanning the ground below. He grabbed the hatchling and pressed himself against the far wall, heart pounding, watching the lights creep closer and closer to the shed. For a long, terrifying moment, one of the drones paused directly above the ridge, overlooking his hiding place, as though something had caught its attention. Then, just as suddenly, it moved on, continuing its sweep further down the valley. Daniel exhaled slowly, the hatchling trembling silently against his chest, and understood with sudden clarity that hiding was no longer a choice he could make forever. Sooner or later, someone was going to come looking in the right place, and when they did, he needed to know exactly what he was protecting, and why an entire kingdom seemed desperate to get it back. The soldier found him on a morning so quiet that Daniel almost missed the sound of boots crunching over gravel until it was too late to hide. He had gone out to check a snare he had set near the tree line, hopping for something to eat besides ration bars, when a voice called out behind him, sharp and commanding. "Don't move!" Daniel froze, hands raised slowly, and turned his head just enough to see a young soldier standing a dozen steps away, rifle raised, but hands visibly unsteady. The soldier wore the deep green uniform of the Royal Tracking Corps, a rank Daniel recognized from the patrols that occasionally passed near the settlement. He looked barely out of his teenage years, with sharp eyes that darted nervously between Daniel's face and the direction of the shed hidden behind the ridge. "I know you have been out here," the soldier said. "Tracks near the ravine, blood that isn't yours, you've been hiding something." Daniel kept his hands raised, mind racing through every possible lie he could offer and settling on none of them fast enough. "I'm just trying to survive out here, that's all." "Don't lie to me." The soldier's voice cracked slightly, betraying his youth despite the authority in his posture. "My name is Corin. I've been assigned to find a missing royal asset, and every trail I've followed for the past week leads back toward this ridge." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind moving through the trees. Daniel considered his options. Running was pointless against a trained tracker. Fighting was worse, considering the rifle pointed at his chest. Lying had already failed. That left only one path forward, the one that felt like walking directly into a fire he could not control. "Come with me," Daniel said quietly, "but you need to understand something before you see it. It's not what you think." Corin hesitated, clearly torn between duty and caution, but curiosity won out. He followed Daniel back toward the shed, rifle still raised, but no longer pointed directly at him, and when Daniel pushed open the door, the hatchling immediately hopped forward to greet him, tail wagging in an almost dog-like motion despite its splintered leg. Corin's rifle nearly slipped from his hands. That's a royal hatchling." "I found it wounded, half buried near a crashed pod in Blackrock Cut," Daniel said. "I didn't steal it. I didn't hurt it. I just couldn't leave it there to die." Corin stared at the creature for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes as the hatchling nuzzled curiously against his boot, showing none of the fear or aggression he had clearly been trained to expect from a feral or stolen royal beast. "This isn't right," he muttered, almost to himself. "Lost dragons are always found quickly. Always. The tracking wards on their scales make them impossible to lose for more than a day, let alone a week." "Maybe someone made sure it couldn't be tracked," Daniel said. Corin's jaw tightened, the implication settling heavily in the silence between them. He knelt down slowly, studying the hatchling's scales with a soldier's trained eye, tracing the faint lines beneath its skin that Daniel had noticed days before with his scanner. These markings, Corrin said quietly. "I've never seen anything like this on a royal dragon before. This isn't standard." Daniel pulled out his scanner and showed him the readings from days earlier, watching Corrin's expression shift from confusion to something closer to alarm. For nearly an hour, the two of them sat together, an unlikely pair bound by circumstance, comparing notes and theories neither of them wanted to believe. "There's an old cache," Corrin finally said, breaking the silence. "Restricted territory, deep in the hills past Blackrock Cut. My unit was told it was an ancient burial site, off-limits by royal decree, but the security around it always felt excessive for something that old." "You think that's connected to this?" Corrin looked at the hatchling, which had curled itself contentedly against Daniel's leg, and nodded slowly. "The pod you found it in, the crash site, it's directly on the path toward that cache. I don't think that's a coincidence." Against every instinct of duty drilled into him since childhood, Corrin made a choice that would have ended his career, or worse, had anyone from his unit been watching. He lowered his rifle completely and extended a hand toward Daniel, not in threat, but in uneasy alliance. "I need to know what's really going on," he said, "and I think you're the only person who might actually help me find out." They set out the next morning before dawn, moving carefully to avoid the patrol routes Corrin knew by memory, the hatchling wrapped securely in a sling across Daniel's chest, silent and watchful as they climbed higher into the restricted hills. The terrain grew steeper and rockier, the trees thinning until only stone and scattered brush remained, and eventually they reached a section of hillside marked by an old stone archway, half collapsed and covered in moss, bearing a royal seal unlike any Corrin had ever seen in his training. "This doesn't match any current dynasty marking," he said, running his fingers along the worn stone. "This is old, older than anything I've studied." Daniel felt the hatchling stir against his chest, suddenly alert, its small body trembling with something that looked less like fear and more like recognition. It let out a low hum, the same sound Daniel had heard when he first scanned it days earlier, and the stone archway responded with a faint pulse of light along its carved edges, as if waking from a long sleep. Corrin took a step back, eyes wide with disbelief. "That's not possible. Stone doesn't do that." But it had happened, and there was no denying what stood before them now. The hatchling had led them, unknowingly or not, directly to something the kingdom had buried and forgotten, sealed away behind layers of restricted territory and old decrees meant to keep it hidden from everyone, including its own people. Whatever waited beyond that archway, both of them understood there was no turning back now. The passage beyond the archway sloped downward into darkness, the air growing cooler and heavier with every step. Corrin activated a small light mounted on his rifle, casting a narrow beam across walls carved with symbols neither of them recognized. Patterns that mixed old Ostravi script with something that looked disturbingly familiar to Daniel, though he could not immediately place why. The hatchling had grown more restless the deeper they went, squirming gently in its sling until Daniel finally set it down, allowing it to hop and drag itself ahead of them with surprising confidence for a creature that had never walked these halls before. It moved with purpose, as though some part of it remembered a path its body had never physically taken. "It's leading us," Corrin said quietly, watching the hatchling pause at each junction only briefly before choosing a direction without hesitation. "It knows where it's going." They followed it through a series of narrowing tunnels until the passage opened suddenly into a massive chamber, so large that Corrin's light could not reach the far walls. Daniel raised his own handheld lamp, and slowly the details of the chamber revealed themselves in pieces. Skeletal remains lined the walls, some clearly organic, the bones of enormous dragons long since turned to dust and stone, but others were unmistakably different, metal frames fused seamlessly with bone, wires and plating woven into what should have been purely biological structures. Daniel had spent years working with old machinery, salvaging and repairing whatever he could find to survive, and even he had never seen anything built quite like this. "These aren't just dragons," he said slowly, running his light along one of the nearest frames. "These are machines, or they were at some point." Corin approached one of the larger skeletons, tracing the fused metal along its ribs with a shaking hand. This can't be right. Our histories say the royal dragons are sacred, born of the old gods, tied to the bloodline of kings since before recorded time. Not this. They moved deeper into the chamber, past rows of dormant machinery half buried beneath centuries of dust, until they reached a raised platform at the center of the room. Old terminals lined its edges, faintly glowing despite what must have been decades, if not centuries, of neglect. Daniel approached cautiously, brushing dust away from one of the screens, and felt his breath catch when familiar symbols flickered weakly across its surface. "This is human tech," he said, disbelief coloring his voice. "Old but human. I recognize this coding structure. I've seen fragments of it in salvage yards back on colony worlds." Corin stared at him, something breaking behind his eyes. "That's impossible. Humans only arrived on Ostrava within living memory. The treaties were signed less than 50 years ago." "Then explain this," Daniel said, gesturing around the chamber. "Explain a facility buried this deep, sealed behind royal decrees, filled with human technology fused into what your entire culture worships as sacred, untouchable creatures." Neither of them had an answer, but the hatchling did, in its own way. It hopped up onto the platform beside them and pressed its small snout against one of the terminals, letting out a long, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very stone beneath their feet. Slowly, other terminals around the chamber began flickering to life, one after another, casting pale light across the ancient machinery and revealing rows of frozen data logs, records untouched for longer than either of them could guess. Corin began scanning through the nearest log, his soldiers' training allowing him to parse through old Ostravi script far faster than Daniel could manage. His face grew paler with every line he read. "These records speak of an alliance," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "A joint project between early human settlers and the old Ostravi dynasty, long before any treaty we have ever been taught about. They built these guardians together, not as weapons, but as protectors, meant to defend both peoples during a time of great danger." "So what happened?" Daniel asked. Corin scrolled further, his expression darkening. "The records stop abruptly. Something went wrong. The project was sealed, the truth buried, and the guardians reduced to myth, twisted over generations into symbols of royal bloodline purity instead of what they actually were." The hatchling let out another hum, softer this time, and one final terminal at the center of the platform flickered awake, displaying a single line of glowing text that made both of them go still. "Genetic key required, Guardian core dormant, awaiting authorized bloodline signature." "It's not magic," Daniel said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "It's not royal blood either, not in the way your people think. It's this, it's them." He gestured toward the hatchling. "The dragons aren't sacred because of some divine bloodline. They're sacred because they're the last living key to whatever this place really is." Before either of them could process the weight of that discovery, a distant clang echoed through the tunnels behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of multiple footsteps moving with practiced, military precision. Corin's face went white. "That's not my unit. Those footsteps, that formation, that belongs to the Council's private guard." Daniel scooped up the hatchling instinctively, pulling it close against his chest as the footsteps grew louder, closing in fast from the tunnel they had entered through. Whoever was coming clearly knew exactly what this place was, and judging by the urgency in their approach, they had no intention of letting either Daniel or Corin walk out alive with what they now knew. "We need to move," Corin said, already backing toward the far side of the chamber, searching desperately for another way out. But the chamber, ancient and half forgotten as it was, offered no easy escape, and within moments, the first shadows of armed soldiers appeared at the tunnel entrance, weapons raised, eyes locked directly on the hatchling cradled protectively in Daniel's arms. The council guards spread out across the chamber entrance with practiced efficiency, their weapons trained on Daniel and Corin without hesitation. At their front stood a tall officer with cold eyes and a voice that carried easily across the massive space. "Soldier Corin," the officer said, recognizing the young tracker's uniform immediately. "Step aside. This does not concern you. With respect, Corrin said, his voice shaking only slightly, I was ordered to recover a missing royal asset. I have done that. Your orders end here, the officer replied. This location does not exist in any record you are authorized to know. Hand over the hatchling, and you will both be permitted to leave quietly. Daniel did not believe that for a second, and judging by the tension in Corrin's shoulders, neither did he. Whoever these soldiers answered to, they were not here to quietly resolve a misunderstanding. They were here to erase a problem, and both Daniel and Corrin currently qualified as exactly that. You already know what this place is, Daniel said, buying time, scanning the chamber for anything that might help them. You knew before we did. That's why you sealed it, why you buried the truth under stories about royal bloodlines and sacred beasts. The officer's expression did not change, but something in his eyes flickered, confirming Daniel's suspicion without a single word spoken. The truth serves no one, he said finally. The kingdom stands because of the myth, not despite it. Hand over the creature. Daniel's mind raced, memories of years spent salvaging old machinery flooding back as his eyes landed on the dormant terminals lining the platform behind them. If this facility truly ran on old human systems he had spent his entire life learning to repair and repurpose out of necessity, then maybe, just maybe, he had an advantage these soldiers did not expect. Corrin, he said quietly, without looking away from the officer, how much do you trust me right now? Not nearly enough, Corrin muttered back, but probably more than I trust them. Good enough. Daniel took a slow step backward toward the platform, keeping the hatchling shielded against his chest with one arm while his other hand found the edge of the nearest terminal. Buy me 30 seconds. Corrin, despite clearly not understanding the plan, raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the ceiling, sending chips of ancient stone raining down and forcing the guards to scatter for cover instinctively. It was not much, but it was enough. Daniel's fingers moved quickly across the terminal, drawing on years of experience jury-rigging broken machines with nothing but scrap and desperation. The system beneath his hands was old, unfamiliar in its specific layout, but built on principles he recognized deep in his bones, the same foundational human engineering he had grown up learning to fix out of necessity rather than choice. Lights flickered along the chamber walls as dormant defense systems, untouched for generations, began stuttering back to life. Old turrets embedded in the stone groaned as they rotated toward the unfamiliar intruders, and a low mechanical hum built steadily beneath the chamber floor. What did you do? Corrin shouted over the rising noise, ducking behind a fallen pillar as the guards began returning fire. Reminded this place it still has a job to do, Daniel called back, pulling the hatchling tighter against his chest as he dove for cover alongside him. The ancient turrets, though weakened by centuries of dormancy, still carried enough charge to force the council guards into a full retreat, their formation breaking apart under fire from systems they clearly had never expected to encounter. The officer barked orders, attempting to rally his soldiers, but the chamber itself seemed to be fighting back now, ancient defenses activating one after another as the hatchling let out a series of resonant hums, its small body glowing faintly along the circuitry lines beneath its scales. It was not aggression, Daniel realized watching the creature closely even in the chaos. It was recognition. The hatchling was communicating with the systems around them, waking a defense network that had been built specifically to protect creatures exactly like it. Within minutes, the remaining guards retreated back through the tunnel they had come from, the officer shouting furious commands that grew fainter as they withdrew, clearly unwilling to lose more soldiers to a facility they barely understood. Silence, heavy and ringing, settled back over the chamber, broken only by the soft hum of the turrets slowly powering back down. Corrin lowered his rifle slowly, staring at Daniel with something between disbelief and reluctant respect. You just fought off the council's private guard with technology that's been buried for who knows how long. I fixed old machines for a living, Daniel said, breathing hard, still cradling the trembling hatchling against him. Turns out that skill translates better than I expected. But the danger, they both understood, was far from over. The officer had retreated, not surrendered, and men like that did not simply walk away from failure. Somewhere above them, orders were already being given, and whatever faction within the council had been desperate enough to hide this place for so long would not stop after a single setback. Corin knelt beside the nearest terminal, studying the data logs still glowing faintly across its surface, his expression grim. These records mention a faction within the old court that opposed the alliance from the very beginning. They believed sharing power with outsiders would weaken the throne. I think that same faction still exists today, hidden within the current council. And they've been protecting this secret ever since, Daniel said, not to keep it safe, but to keep it buried. The hatchling shifted in his arms, its golden eyes fixed steadily on the glowing terminal ahead, as if it understood, in whatever way a creature like it could understand, that the truth they had uncovered was far bigger than either of them had first realized. Whatever came next, there was no going back to quiet obscurity now. Daniel Hale, once nothing more than a forgotten exile scavenging for scrap in the mud, had just become a direct threat to a secret the kingdom had guarded for generations, and the people responsible for burying that secret were not going to let it resurface without a fight. Word of what happened beneath Blackrock Cut spread faster than either Daniel or Corin expected, though not in the way the retreating council guards had hoped. Corin, against every instinct of self-preservation, chose to report directly to the head of the Royal Tracking Corps rather than the council officials who technically outranked him, bringing with him data logs pulled directly from the ancient terminals as proof of everything they had uncovered. The head of the Tracking Corps, an older woman named Talia who had served the crown for decades, listened to the entire account without interruption, her expression unreadable throughout. When Corin finished, laying the recovered data pad on the table between them, she remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking. I always wondered why the restricted zones near Blackrock Cut required a level of security that never matched their supposed purpose, she said quietly. Burial sites do not need active defense turrets. You believe us? Corin asked, clearly bracing for the opposite reaction. I believe the evidence in front of me, Talia said, tapping the data pad. Whether the throne believes it is another matter entirely, and that is where things become dangerous. Word moved carefully through trusted channels over the following days, avoiding the council members. Corin, now suspected of belonging to the hidden faction, determined to keep the truth buried. Daniel remained hidden with the hatchling during this time, aware that stepping out into the open too soon could easily paint a target on both their backs before the truth had a chance to take root. It was Talia, eventually, who arranged a private audience with the reigning monarch himself, a cautious and agging ruler named Bastian who had inherited a throne built on stories he had never once questioned during his long reign. When presented with the data logs, the ancient facilities records, and the undeniable evidence of technology fused seamlessly into what his entire kingdom worshipped as sacred bloodline creatures, Bastian sat in silence for nearly an hour before speaking a single word. Show me. Daniel, still cautious, but increasingly aware that hiding forever was no longer an option, agreed to guide a small, trusted party back into the chamber beneath Blackrock Cut, the hatchling once again cradled safely in his arms. What the monarch witnessed there, standing among the fused remains of ancient guardians and glowing terminals filled with forgotten history, shattered generations of carefully constructed myth in a matter of hours. The records were clear, once properly translated and cross-referenced by scholars Talia trusted completely. Centuries ago, early human settlers, stranded and desperate after a catastrophic journey through unfamiliar space, had made contact with the ancient Ostravi dynasty. Rather than conflict, the two peoples had chosen cooperation, combining human engineering with Ostravi understanding of the natural guardians native to their world, creating protectors meant to defend both civilizations during a period of external threat long since forgotten by modern records. But cooperation had bred resentment among certain factions within the old court, those who believed sharing power and knowledge with outsiders threatened the purity and authority of the throne. Rather than allow the truth to spread, they had buried the facility, erased the alliance from official history, and slowly transformed the Guardians into symbols of royal bloodline superiority instead of what they truly were, a monument to two peoples working together. That same resentment, Bastian soon discovered, had never fully disappeared. Several members of his own council were quickly implicated as descendants of that same old faction, their private guard responsible for the attack beneath Blackrock Cut, their motivations rooted in centuries-old fear rather than any genuine loyalty to the crown they claimed to serve. Bastian did not act rashly, but he did act decisively, removing the implicated council members from power and ordering a full investigation into how deeply the old faction's influence still ran through his kingdom. It was not a perfect resolution, and Daniel understood that unraveling generations of hidden corruption would take far longer than a single dramatic revelation in an underground chamber. But it was a start, and more importantly, it was the truth finally allowed to breathe after centuries of silence. Daniel himself became an unlikely figure of public attention in the weeks that followed, no longer viewed as merely another struggling outsider scraping by on the edges of society, but as the man who had saved the last natural-born dragon and exposed a conspiracy buried at the very heart of the kingdom's history. It was not a role he had ever wanted, but it was one he found himself settling into with quiet determination. The hatchling, now fully healed, remained close to him through it all, its bond to him unmistakable to anyone who saw them together. Scholars debated whether the connection was purely emotional or something rooted in whatever mechanisms lay hidden beneath its scales, but Daniel found he did not particularly care about the explanation. It trusted him, and he had no intention of abandoning that trust now that the danger had passed. Corin, meanwhile, was formally commended for his role in uncovering the conspiracy, promoted under Talia's direct guidance to help lead a newly formed division tasked specifically with investigating other potential sites hidden throughout Ostrava's restricted territories. It was slow, careful work, but work that finally aimed to build understanding rather than bury it. Months later, standing once again at the edge of Blackrock Cut, this time without fear of patrols or hidden enemies, Daniel watched the hatchling explore the open hillside freely, its wings finally strong enough for short, clumsy flights that always ended in an enthusiastic tumble across the grass. Corin joined him there, arms crossed, watching the same scene with a small, genuine smile. "You could leave, you know," Corin said. "Now that the danger has passed, go back to wherever you came from originally." Daniel considered the question for a long moment, watching the hatchling attempt another wobbling flight before crashing happily into a pile of leaves. "I used to think I was just passing through this world," he said finally, "something temporary, but I don't think that's true anymore." "So you're staying?" "Someone has to help make sure this history doesn't get buried again," Daniel said. "Besides, I don't think that one is letting me leave anytime soon." As if understanding him perfectly, the hatchling bounded back toward him, nearly knocking him over with enthusiastic affection. And for the first time since crashing onto this world years ago, Daniel Hale felt something close to belonging settle firmly into place. The kingdom's greatest secret had finally seen the light after generations buried in darkness, not through conquest or grand rebellion, but through the simple, stubborn kindness of one man who had refused to walk away from a wounded creature in the mud. And as the sun set gently over Blackrock Cut, casting long shadows across a world slowly beginning to remember its forgotten history, that quiet act of compassion had changed the course of an entire kingdom forever.